I never told my family that I was the anonymous investor holding $35 billion worth of shares in my sister's company. For years, they believed I was exactly what I appeared to be: a quiet, unremarkable woman with a modest job, an aging car, and no visible ambition. At family gatherings, I sat near the edge of the table, smiled at the right moments, and listened while they spoke about success as if it were something that had simply skipped me by accident. They thought my silence meant agreement, or acceptance, or failure. What they didn't know was that my silence was deliberate. I had learned early that people reveal their truest beliefs not when they're challenged, but when they think no one is watching, when they believe you have nothing they need. For a long time, I let my family believe exactly that. I wanted to see how far their certainty would go. I wanted to understand how easily love could become conditional, how quickly respect disappeared when power was invisible. The irony was that every milestone they celebrated in my sister's career, the promotions, the awards, the sudden rise everyone called remarkable, had passed through my hands first. I approved the funding. I protected the company when markets turned. I kept the structure intact when failure would have been easier, and I did it quietly from the shadows, watching my own family praise the outcome while dismissing the person who made it possible. I didn't plan to expose the truth that night. But some moments don't ask for permission before they change everything. I was 35 years old, and by most outward measures, my life looked small. I lived alone in a compact apartment in a quiet part of the city, worked as a financial consultant on paper, and kept my routines intentionally ordinary. I liked it that way. Ordinary made people careless. Ordinary made them honest. My parents had always believed that potential announced itself loudly. They admired confidence, titles, visibility. My younger sister Vivian embodied all of it effortlessly. She was brilliant, driven, and publicly successful, everything they understood how to value. They spoke her name with pride, introduced her accomplishments to strangers, and framed her rise as proof that they had done something right. And me? I was the contrast. The example they didn't mean to make, but did anyway. At dinners, my mother would ask Vivian about her latest project, her latest trip, her next step. My father would nod approvingly, adding commentary about leadership and vision. When conversation turned to me, it was brief, polite, almost apologetic. "What are you working on these days, Ellie?" the way someone asks about the weather when they don't expect much to change. I never corrected them. I never filled in the gaps. I let the assumptions settle where they landed. The truth was, I had started investing quietly in my early 20s, long before Vivian joined the company that would later define her career. I had seen potential where others saw risk, and I had structured my involvement carefully, anonymously, through layers designed to protect distance. When the company faltered during its early expansion, I stepped in. When a major acquisition threatened to sink it, I stabilized the balance sheet. When internal politics could have derailed Vivian's division, I intervened indirectly, removing obstacles she never knew existed. None of it was done for recognition. At least, not at first. I told myself I was protecting the company, protecting her, protecting the work. But somewhere along the way, my silence became something else, a test I never admitted I was running. Not of Vivian's ability, but of my family's values. They believed success belonged to the visible. They believed power always announced itself. I wanted to know how they treated the person they thought had none. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon. A message from my mother, short and formal, asking us all to meet later that week to celebrate Vivian's latest achievement. The company was finalizing a high-profile expansion, one that had drawn industry attention. My parents were proud. They always were. I stared at the message longer than necessary, already aware of the undercurrent. These dinners were never just dinners. They were performances. Hierarchies reinforced over dessert. I agreed to go. That evening, I arrived early as I usually did. Vivian was already there, glowing with the kind of energy that comes from being affirmed everywhere you turn. She hugged me warmly, genuinely happy to see me. Whatever distance existed between us had never been cruelty. It had been habit. A dynamic formed before either of us understood how to question it. My parents followed soon after, carrying that familiar mix of affection and expectation. They barely noticed when I took my usual seat. Their focus was already on Vivian, on what the night represented. As they spoke, I listened. I always did. But this time something felt different. The company, the expansion, the future, it was all being discussed as if it were fully under their control, as if the outcome were guaranteed, as if the foundation beneath it all were unshakable. I felt the weight of what I knew press quietly against my ribs. No one at that table understood how fragile the moment actually was. No one realized how much of their certainty rested on a choice I had made years ago and could unmake just as easily. And as I watched them celebrate a version of reality that excluded me entirely, I understood something with unsettling clarity. Silence had taught me everything I needed to know. The question was no longer whether they would see me differently if they knew the truth. The question was whether they deserved access to it at all. By the time I was old enough to understand the pattern, it had already settled into the walls of our family like something permanent. Not loud, not cruel, just quietly assumed. Vivian was the one with momentum. I was the one who adjusted. At first, the comparisons were subtle, compliments wrapped in concern, pride softened with advice. My parents never said Vivian was better than me outright. They didn't need to. They spoke her name with expectation and mine with accommodation. Vivian was going places. I was steady, reliable, safe. That was the word my mother liked most. Safe was what you called a life you didn't quite understand, but had already decided not to admire. Growing up, Vivian and I had been close in the way siblings often are when age separates them just enough to prevent rivalry. She followed me around the house when we were younger, asked endless questions, borrowed my clothes without asking. I helped her with homework, walked her to school, defended her when she was too small to defend herself. Back then, no one talked about potential or trajectory. We were just sisters. The shift came gradually, almost politely. Vivian discovered her talent early. She was sharp, charismatic, naturally confident in rooms full of adults. Teachers praised her. Mentors noticed her. My parents leaned in. They attended her events with a different kind of focus, the kind that said, "This mattered." When she spoke, they listened. When I spoke, they nodded. I learned to stop finishing my sentences. By the time Vivian entered the professional world, the roles were already defined. She was the future. I was the background. Family conversations revolved around her deadlines, her stress, her wins. When I shared something about my own work, it was met with polite encouragement, quickly redirected back to Vivian's progress. I didn't resent her for it. That part surprised me the most. Vivian never demanded the attention. She accepted it because it was offered, because it had always been offered. She worked hard. She earned her praise. The problem wasn't her ambition. It was the way everyone else arranged themselves around it, including me. I became the flexible one. If a family gathering needed rescheduling to accommodate Vivian's calendar, it moved. If someone needed to handle logistics, I stepped in. If emotional support was required, I provided it quietly without expectation. It was understood that my time was available, my needs negotiable. No one asked. They simply assumed. I noticed how my parents spoke about sacrifice, but only in one direction. They praised Vivian's dedication to her career as noble, necessary. When I adjusted my own life around those demands, it was framed as practicality, as being realistic, as knowing my place. The phrase stung more than I admitted even to myself. I watched this dynamic deepen when Vivian joined the company that would eventually define her rise. From the outside, it looked like an extraordinary opportunity. From the inside, I saw the fractures immediately. I saw the risks no one wanted to name. I saw the fragile balance propped up by optimism and overconfidence. And I stepped in. Not because anyone asked me to, not because I wanted credit. I stepped in because I could, and because failure would have hurt more than my pride. I structured investments carefully anonymously, shielding my involvement from public view. I didn't want influence. I wanted stability. Vivian never knew. My parents never suspected. They praised her resilience during difficult quarters, her leadership during uncertainty. They spoke about her intuition, her timing, her brilliance. I listened, knowing exactly how close the company had come to collapse more than once, knowing how different the story could have been. I let the praise stand. There were moments, small, quiet moments, when I wondered if I should tell them. Not about the money, not about the scale, just enough to shift the narrative. Enough to remind them that my life wasn't empty simply because it was quiet. But every time I considered it, I watched them interact with me as if I were a fixed point, unchanging, uncomplicated. The assumptions were comfortable. For them. For me, they became instructive. I began to see how easily love turned into expectation. How quickly gratitude became entitlement when someone believed your role was to give without being seen. My parents spoke openly about what Vivian deserved, about how much pressure she carried, about the sacrifices she made. No one spoke about mine. That was when I stopped wondering if the dynamic would correct itself. It wouldn't. Not without disruption. And disruption, I realized, didn't always have to be loud. So I stayed quiet. I observed how often my parents asked me to help Vivian in ways they never would have asked her to help me. I noticed how my presence became functional, not personal. Useful, not valued. I was the person they relied on without acknowledging reliance at all. And the more invisible I became, the more honest they were. They spoke freely in front of me, assuming I had nothing to offer beyond my availability. They discussed Vivian's future as if it were the family's collective investment, something everyone should support unquestioningly. They framed my lack of visible success as proof that I had chosen comfort over ambition. They never considered that I might have chosen clarity instead. By the end of that year, I understood something with uncomfortable precision. My family didn't see me because they didn't need to. As long as I stayed quiet, adjusted, accommodated, there was no incentive for them to look closer. And in that realization, something inside me shifted. Silence was no longer just how I survived family gatherings. It became a lens, a way to see who people were when they believed you didn't matter. A way to measure how far they would go when they thought your role was fixed and your value already decided. I didn't withdraw. I didn't confront anyone. I simply watched. And what I saw made one thing clear. The story they told about me wasn't going to change on its own. The first time I realized how completely my role had been rewritten, it wasn't during an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It happened in the middle of an ordinary phone call, the kind that barely registers as memory, until you replay it later and hear it differently. My mother called to ask if I could adjust my schedule the following week. Vivian had an important presentation coming up, and the family wanted to be available in case she needed support. She said it gently, almost apologetically, as if she were asking a favor. I said yes without hesitation. Of course I could. I always could. What struck me wasn't the request itself. It was the certainty underneath it. The assumption that my time was flexible by default, that my priorities could bend without consequence, that whatever I was doing mattered less. She never asked what I would be giving up. That was the moment I understood that my silence had already taught them how to treat me. From then on, the pattern became easier to see. Requests grew more frequent and less careful. Help was expected, not acknowledged. My availability was treated like a permanent resource, something that existed for the family to draw from whenever needed. When Vivian traveled for work, I was asked to check in on our parents. When my parents worried about Vivian's stress, I was asked to listen, to reassure, to smooth things over. When logistics needed handling, reservations, schedules, small details that held everything together, they turned to me instinctively. It was never framed as obligation. It was framed as common sense. "You're just better at these things," my father said once, waving a hand as if that explained everything. "You're more grounded." Grounded became another word for expendable. Vivian didn't question it. Why would she? This was the world she had grown up in. Support appeared when she needed it. Problems were handled before they reached her. She was focused on moving forward, on delivering results, on becoming the person everyone expected her to be. I didn't blame her. I blamed the structure that had made this normal. The more invisible my support became, the more comfortable everyone grew relying on it. My parents stopped checking in on how I was doing altogether. They assumed that if something were wrong, I would say so. They trusted my silence as proof that everything was fine. I let them. There was a specific evening that marked the turning point for me, though. I didn't realize its significance until later. We were all together for dinner, nothing formal, just a casual gathering. Vivian was talking excitedly about a new initiative at work, something ambitious, risky. My father leaned forward, fully engaged. My mother asked thoughtful questions. The room buzzed with admiration. I had thoughts about the initiative, real ones. Concerns I knew mattered. I opened my mouth to speak. My father cut in mid-sentence, redirecting the conversation to a related topic. No malice, no apology, just momentum carrying on without me. I closed my mouth and listened as they discussed a decision I had already influenced behind the scenes, one I had weighed carefully, approved quietly. No one noticed my silence. No one wondered what I had been about to say. That was when it clicked. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was alignment. They were perfectly aligned with a version of me that required nothing from them and gave everything to them. And as long as I didn't disrupt that image, they had no reason to adjust. I went home that night with a strange sense of calm. Something had clarified. I stopped hoping for recognition. I stopped waiting for fairness. I stopped expecting my family to notice the imbalance on their own. Instead, I started watching more closely. I paid attention to how decisions were made, who was consulted, who was thanked. I noticed how often my parents spoke about sacrifice when it came to Vivian's career and how rarely they acknowledged mine. I observed how easily my contributions were absorbed into the background, how quickly they became invisible once they were reliable. And I made a choice. I decided not to correct them. Not yet. Silence, I realized, was no longer just a habit. It was a test. If I stayed quiet, if I continued to provide support without asserting myself, how far would they go? How much would they take for granted? How deeply had they internalized the idea that my role was fixed? This wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. Over the following months, the requests escalated. My parents asked me to handle things they once would have managed themselves. Vivian assumed I would be available whenever she needed an extra set of hands, an extra layer of reassurance. None of it was unkind. That was what made it dangerous. Entitlement rarely announces itself with cruelty. It grows in comfort. I noticed how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. How conversations about the future never included me. My life was treated as stable, settled, complete, as if there were nothing left to build, nothing at stake. They mistook my restraint for limitation. There were moments when the weight of it pressed hard against my chest, when I wondered if staying silent meant betraying myself. But each time I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't waiting for validation. I was gathering information. And the information was damning. My family didn't just underestimate me. They depended on me precisely because they believed I would never stop giving. They had built their expectations around my silence, and they were comfortable there. By the end of that year, I no longer questioned whether speaking up would change things. It would. But not in the way I wanted. Words alone wouldn't undo years of assumption. A single conversation wouldn't dismantle a structure built on convenience. Something more fundamental had to shift. So I stayed quiet. I continued to support, to observe, to let the pattern unfold. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I needed to see the full shape of what I was standing inside. And what I saw with increasing clarity was a family that believed my silence meant consent. They were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. People hear nothing and assume there is nothing to hear. They mistake restraint for emptiness, stillness for lack of thought. I had spent years letting my family believe that about me, watching them grow comfortable inside that assumption. They treated my quiet like permission. Permission to speak over me. Permission to decide for me. Permission to assume I would always be there, always available, always willing to bend. The less I asserted myself, the more certain they became that I never would. And certainty, I learned, is intoxicating to people who like control. I didn't correct them. Not because I didn't notice, but because I did. There was a strange power in being underestimated. It stripped away performance. People stopped being careful around me. They spoke freely, acted instinctively, revealed what they truly believed when they thought there were no consequences. I began to see my family with an uncomfortable clarity. My parents grew increasingly comfortable making decisions that affected me without consulting me. Plans were announced, not discussed. Schedules were assumed to be flexible on my end. If something needed to be handled quietly, efficiently, without recognition, it found its way to me. "You don't mind," my mother would say, already moving on to the next topic. And I didn't say that I did. They mistook my silence for generosity, or worse, for obligation. Vivian never intended to take advantage of me, but she did so effortlessly. She spoke about her career as if it existed in a vacuum, untouched by anyone else's labor. When she needed reassurance, she came to me. When she needed perspective, she called me. When she needed something handled so she could focus on her work, she assumed I would step in. I always had. Her confidence wasn't arrogance, it was inheritance. She had grown up in a world where support appeared without explanation, where obstacles dissolved before they became visible, where success felt personal because the structure holding it up remained unseen. I watched this dynamic deepen over time. The more I stayed quiet, the more the family leaned into it. My presence became functional. I was the person you relied on, not the person you listened to. Useful, dependable, invisible. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, that shifted something inside me. We were gathered one afternoon discussing a decision that would affect the coming months. Vivian was explaining a potential change in her schedule due to work demands. My parents nodded immediately, adjusting their own plans to accommodate her. I began to speak, opening my mouth to mention a conflict on my end, something that mattered. My father interrupted me mid-sentence. He didn't even realize he had done it. The conversation simply flowed around my unfinished thought, picking up speed without me. No one noticed that I had stopped talking. No one asked what I was about to say. I sat there, hands folded, listening as they rearranged a future that included my time but not my voice. That was the moment I stopped believing this was accidental. I felt no anger then, just a sharp, settling awareness. Silence, I realized, had consequences. Not just for how others treated me, but for what they felt entitled to take. By staying quiet, I had allowed my boundaries to dissolve. And where there are no boundaries, expectations grow unchecked. That night I went home and thought about the years behind me, about the dinners where I had listened more than spoken, about the plans made on my behalf, about the way my contributions were absorbed and forgotten the moment they became reliable. I asked myself a hard question. If I spoke now, would anything truly change? Or would they simply adjust their tone, offer temporary apologies, and return to the same assumptions once the discomfort passed? I knew the answer. So I made a different choice. I decided to remain silent, but no longer passively. I would continue to observe, but with intention. I would let the pattern play out fully, without intervening, without correcting, without softening the edges. If my family believed my silence meant consent, I wanted to see exactly how far that belief extended. This wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity. Over the following weeks, the entitlement sharpened. My parents grew bolder in their requests, less careful in their phrasing. They spoke about my flexibility as if it were a permanent trait rather than a choice. They framed my availability as a given. Vivian began assuming I would adjust my life around hers without asking, not out of malice, but habit, the habit of being supported without needing to acknowledge the support. Each time it happened, something tightened inside me, not resentment, but resolve. I stopped offering suggestions unless asked. I stopped stepping in preemptively. I listened more, spoke less. I let silences stretch. I noticed how uncomfortable it made them when I didn't fill the gaps they had grown used to. Still, no one apologized. No one questioned the dynamic. They simply adjusted, confident that I would continue to accommodate. That was when I understood the truth of my situation. My family didn't see my silence as patience. They saw it as permanence. They believed this was who I was, someone who would always give without asking, adjust without complaint, remain steady so others could shine. And as long as they believed that there was no incentive for them to change. The emotional cost of this realization was heavier than I expected. There were nights when the loneliness pressed hard, when I wondered if staying silent meant erasing myself completely. But I refused to turn that pain into self-pity. I needed it to stay sharp, honest. Because beneath it all, something larger was coming. I could feel it in the way my parents spoke about Vivian's future, about expectations growing heavier, about sacrifices they assumed I would continue to make. There was an unspoken belief that I would always absorb the impact, that I would always be the one who adjusted when demands increased. They were preparing to ask more of me. And I knew with quiet certainty that when that moment came, silence alone would no longer be enough. But for now, I held it. I watched. I listened. I let my family show me exactly who they were when they believed I had nothing to withhold. By the end of that season, one truth was undeniable. My silence had already answered the question I hadn't known I was asking. Pressure rarely announces itself all at once. It arrives quietly disguised as opportunity wrapped in language that sounds reasonable until you realize how much it expects you to give up. By the time I felt it fully, it was already woven into every conversation about the future. The company was entering a critical phase. Expansion plans were moving from discussion to execution, and with that came risk. Real risk, not the kind glossed over in boardroom optimism. Markets were tightening. Regulatory scrutiny was increasing. One misstep could unravel years of progress. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From where I stood, it looked like a test. No one in my family knew how close the company was to the edge. I had seen the projections before they were polished. I had read the internal assessments that never made it to official presentations. I knew which partnerships were stable and which were held together by confidence alone. And once again, without being asked, I stepped in. Quietly. I reinforced the capital structure, rerouted funding through channels designed to stabilize growth without drawing attention. I approved safeguards that would never be traced back to me. The company didn't just survive that quarter, it surged. Vivian was praised for her leadership under pressure. My parents celebrated her resilience, her vision, her ability to navigate complexity. They never wondered why the crisis never reached her desk. That was the moment when the stakes changed for me. My silence was no longer just a personal choice. It had become a structural support. The company relied on decisions made in rooms Vivian never entered by people who never said my name. And my family had begun to build their expectations around outcomes that depended entirely on my continued involvement. I felt the weight of that responsibility settle heavily. Not because I couldn't carry it, but because no one had asked whether I wanted to. The pressure didn't come directly at first. It surfaced through my parents in the way they spoke about Vivian's future. They talked about how much more she could achieve with the right backing, the right environment, the right sacrifices made on her behalf. They spoke as if those sacrifices were communal, shared evenly. But they weren't. I was the one expected to adjust, to make space, to absorb inconvenience so Vivian could remain focused. My parents spoke about it openly, confidently, assuming my agreement without ever asking for it. "You understand how important this is," my mother said one evening, her tone gentle but certain. "She's carrying so much right now." I understood. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that my understanding had become an obligation. Vivian, for her part, was moving faster than ever. Success had accelerated her life, narrowed her focus. She spoke about long hours, about pressure from above, about expectations that kept rising. When she talked to me, there was relief in her voice. I was the place she unloaded, the space where she didn't have to perform. I listened. I always did. But I noticed something new creeping into our conversations. A subtle assumption that I would continue to be there in exactly the same way. That my support was constant, inexhaustible. That nothing in my own life might require the same care. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked if I was available. The company's success became the unspoken justification for everything. Long calls, last-minute requests, family plans rearranged around corporate timelines. My parents framed it as temporary as necessary, as something that would eventually pay off for all of us. For all of us, they said. But the benefits were never shared evenly. I began to feel like a load-bearing wall no one acknowledged, essential but never admired, expected to hold everything up without being seen. There was a particular afternoon when the tension crystallized. We were gathered to discuss an upcoming corporate event, one that would mark a major milestone for the company. Vivian was excited, nervous. My parents were proud already, imagining how this moment would look from the outside. They talked about attendance, about appearances, about optics. They spoke as if they were managing something they fully understood. I knew better. I knew the expansion hinged on approvals not yet secured. I knew the financial exposure was higher than anyone wanted to admit. I knew that one unexpected variable could derail the entire plan. I said nothing. Instead, I listened as they spoke about how important it was that everything go smoothly, about how much was riding on this, about how Vivian needed everyone's support now more than ever. And then my mother turned to me. "You'll help however you can, won't you?" she said, smiling as if the answer were already decided. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder of my role. Something shifted inside me then. Not anger, not even hurt. Just a clear, steady awareness that the line between choice and expectation had been crossed. They weren't asking me to support Vivian anymore. They were assuming I would sacrifice whatever was necessary to ensure her success regardless of the cost to myself. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was sustainable. I went home that night and reviewed everything. The investments, the safeguards, the extent of my involvement. I looked at the systems I had built quietly over the years, the protections I had put in place without recognition or consent. And I asked myself a different question. What would happen if I stopped holding it all together, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but simply because no one had the right to demand my silence as payment for their success? The answer unsettled me. The company wouldn't collapse immediately. It was strong enough for that. But the margin for error would disappear. The invisible safety net I had woven would vanish. Decisions would carry their full weight for the first time. Vivian would still be capable. My parents would still be proud. But the illusion of effortless success would be gone. I realized then that the next phase of this story wasn't about revealing the truth. Not yet. It was about allowing reality to surface. For years I had absorbed the pressure, quietly believing that staying silent was the price of keeping peace. Now I understood that silence had simply postponed a reckoning. The company was moving toward a moment that would demand clarity. And when it came, no amount of quiet support would be enough to protect everyone from the consequences of their assumptions. As I closed my laptop and turned off the light, one thought stayed with me, heavy and unmistakable. I had carried the weight long enough. What came next would determine whether anyone else was willing to carry it too. The demand didn't arrive as a confrontation. It came dressed as concern, softened by familiarity, framed as something reasonable that any supportive family member would naturally agree to. That was how they always did it. By the time I understood what was being asked, refusal had already been labeled unthinkable. It started with a conversation my parents requested just to talk. No urgency in their voices, no warning in their words. We sat in their living room, the same one where Vivian's achievements were displayed like quiet trophies, framed articles, photos from corporate events, reminders of a success story They believed they understood completely. They spoke about pressure, about how much Vivian was carrying, about how the company's next phase required stability, focus, sacrifice. My mother clasped her hands together as she spoke, her tone careful, practiced. "She's giving everything she has," she said. "We all need to do our part." The phrase landed heavier than she intended. My father nodded in agreement, already leaning forward, already certain. "This is a critical moment," he added. "It's not the time for distractions." I listened silent as they circled closer to the point without naming it. They talked about how important it was for Vivian to feel supported, about how stress could derail even the most capable people, about how family was supposed to step in when it mattered most. Then my mother looked directly at me. "We were thinking," she said gently, "that maybe you could take a step back for a while." The words were vague enough to sound harmless. A step back. For a while. She said it like a suggestion, but her eyes told a different story. This wasn't an idea. It was a conclusion they had already reached. From what I asked, keeping my voice neutral. My father answered instead. From anything that might pull focus. Travel. Commitments. You're flexible right now. It would help Vivian if you were fully available. Fully available. The room went quiet after that. Not tense, expectant. They were asking me to reorganize my life around Vivian's needs without acknowledging that I had a life of my own. Not temporarily, not with discussion, but as an extension of a role I had already been playing for years. I realized then that this was the moment my silence had been preparing me for. Vivian hadn't joined the conversation yet. She wasn't there when my parents decided what I should give up. She wouldn't be asked to. This wasn't about her request. It was about their belief that my sacrifice was automatic, that my flexibility was infinite, that my life existed in service of hers. I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. "I'll think about it," I said. My mother smiled with relief. My father relaxed back into his chair. The matter in their minds was settled. Later that evening, Vivian called me. Her voice was tight, exhausted. She talked about deadlines, expectations, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. I listened as I always did, offering space without solutions. "They want everything perfect," she said quietly. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." I thought about the conversation with our parents, about the decision they had made without her, about the assumption that I would absorb whatever pressure needed to be redirected. "They think I should step back so I can support you more," I said carefully. There was a pause on the line. "They do?" Vivian asked, not surprised, just processing. "I didn't agree," I added. Another pause. Longer this time. "I didn't ask for that," she said finally. Her voice held no accusation, just distance. "I didn't even know they were thinking that." "I know," I said. That was the first crack in the structure. Small, but real. After we hung up, I sat alone and let the truth settle. My parents believed my life was expendable because they had never seen it as essential. Vivian had grown used to support she didn't have to name. And I had allowed both to happen by staying silent for too long. This wasn't about whether I loved my sister. I did. This wasn't about whether I wanted her to succeed. I did. This was about the cost of success when it was built on someone else's erasure. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. My parents followed up with gentle reminders, with reassurances about how temporary this would be, with gratitude for my understanding already spoken as if I had given it. They didn't ask if I was willing. They thanked me for being willing. I felt something solidify inside me then. Not anger, not resentment. Resolve. I stopped preemptively smoothing things over. I stopped adjusting my schedule automatically. I stopped stepping in before being asked. I let calls go unanswered longer. I let conversations end without solutions. And slowly discomfort surfaced. My parents noticed first. They commented on my distance, my distraction. They framed it as concern, but there was confusion underneath. This wasn't how I usually behaved. I was reliable, predictable, easy. Vivian noticed too. She asked if everything was okay. I told her the truth, that I was tired, that I needed space, that I couldn't keep absorbing the impact of decisions made without me. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She just listened. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," she said quietly. That admission mattered more than she knew. The demand my parents had made, softened, unspoken, assumed, had crossed a line they didn't know existed. They believed my silence meant availability. They believed my flexibility meant obligation. They were wrong. That week I reviewed my involvement with the company carefully. Every safeguard, every intervention, every invisible thread I had woven to keep things steady. I didn't pull anything apart. Not yet. But I stopped tightening the net. I let systems run as designed. I let decisions move forward without my quiet adjustments. I let reality breathe. The demand had forced my hand not toward confrontation, but toward clarity. I understood now that if I didn't change something, nothing else would. Not my parents' expectations. Not Vivian's trajectory. Not the assumptions that had settled so deeply into the fabric of our family. This was no longer about what they were asking me to give up. It was about whether I was willing to keep giving until there was nothing left. The night they believed they were in control arrived quietly wrapped in confidence and rehearsal. By the time I stepped into the room, every decision had already been made in their minds. I could feel it in the way my parents spoke, in the way Vivian carried herself, in the careful choreography of a gathering designed to impress rather than connect. This was not a family dinner. It was a performance. They had chosen the venue carefully, an upscale private room overlooking the city glass walls, and soft lighting, the kind of place where success looked inevitable. My parents arrived early already in host mode, greeting people with practiced warmth. Vivian followed soon after, composed, polished, carrying the weight of expectation like a tailored jacket she had learned to wear well. No one asked why I was there. That omission told me everything. I took my seat near the end of the table, the familiar position no one questioned anymore. Conversation flowed around me, as if I were part of the furniture present, useful, unobtrusive. They spoke about the company's expansion with confidence that bordered on certainty. My father referenced timelines. My mother spoke about visibility and reputation. Vivian discussed strategy, her voice steady, professional. I listened, already aware of the gaps they were smoothing over with optimism. They believed the foundation beneath them was solid because it always had been. They didn't know that stability had been maintained quietly, deliberately, by someone they no longer bothered to see. They didn't know that the safeguards they relied on had begun to loosen not through sabotage, but through absence. This gathering was meant to signal control. Instead, it exposed assumption. As the evening progressed, the tone sharpened. Questions became statements. Confidence edged toward entitlement. My parents spoke about future commitments as if they were guaranteed, about resources as if they were endless. At one point, my mother leaned slightly toward me, lowering her voice. "You'll help keep things steady, won't you?" she said, smiling as though this were reassurance rather than expectation. I met her gaze and said nothing. The silence lingered longer than she expected. She looked momentarily unsettled, then turned back to the conversation, dismissing the discomfort as irrelevant. Vivian didn't notice. She was deep in discussion with an executive seated across from her, outlining next steps, projecting certainty. She was good at this. I had always known that. Her competence wasn't the illusion. The illusion was how little risk she believed she was carrying. There came a moment, small, almost imperceptible, when the room shifted. An executive asked a question that required a concrete answer. Not vision, not confidence, something structural. Vivian paused just for a second longer than usual. My father glanced toward me instinctively, then stopped himself. My mother adjusted in her chair. The question moved on unanswered, wrapped in vague assurances. I felt the weight of the moment settle quietly. This was the edge. I didn't intervene. I didn't offer clarification. I didn't step in to smooth the uncertainty the way I always had. I let the silence sit where it belonged. From that point on, I noticed the cracks spreading not dramatically but perceptibly. Conversations became slightly more careful. Confidence softened into something more brittle. People spoke in longer sentences, qualifying statements that would have been absolute an hour earlier. My parents sensed it too. They grew quieter, their smiles more fixed. They weren't used to rooms that didn't bend easily to certainty. Vivian, however, felt it most acutely. She remained composed, but I could see the tension beneath the surface. The effortless momentum she was accustomed to had slowed. Not enough to alarm her yet. Enough to unsettle. When the evening finally drew to a close, there was polite applause, careful optimism, promises to follow up. People left with the sense that something important was pending, though no one could quite name what it was. My parents lingered, speaking in hushed tones. Vivian checked her phone, her brow furrowed. On the way out, my father walked beside me. Everything went well, he said, more as a declaration than an observation. I nodded. He waited for more. Reassurance, perhaps. Agreement. I offered none. Outside, the night air felt cooler than I expected. Vivian caught up to me, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You were quiet tonight," she said, not accusingly, just noticing. "I usually am," I replied. She hesitated, then nodded. "Still, things feel heavier." "They are," I said gently. She looked at me, then really looked at me as if trying to see something she hadn't noticed before. "Do you think we're missing something?" she asked. The question wasn't about the company. It was about control. I considered my answer carefully. I think I said that we've all gotten used to things working out without asking why. She absorbed that in silence. My parents joined us then, already discussing next steps, already planning how to move forward as if nothing fundamental had shifted. They spoke over both of us, their confidence rushing back to fill the gap. As we parted ways that night, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just certainty. They believed this gathering had confirmed their control, that whatever uncertainty had surfaced could be managed, smooth-handled quietly by someone else as it always had been. They didn't realize that the person who had always absorbed the risk had stepped back. Not publicly, not dramatically, just enough for reality to breathe. That night marked the point of no return. The moment when assumption met consequence, when silence stopped protecting everyone else and began protecting me. They would feel it soon, not all at once, not in a collapse, but in the slow, unmistakable way that certainty erodes when it is no longer supported. And when that happened, they would finally understand something they had never considered before. Control is easy to claim when someone else is holding the weight. The moment that weight is released, the truth reveals itself. The truth didn't arrive with a speech. It didn't wait for perfect timing or permission. It surfaced the way all buried things eventually do, through pressure, through pause, through the moment when silence stops absorbing impact and lets it land where it belongs. The meeting was supposed to be procedural, a closed-door review before the next phase of expansion attended by senior leadership and a handful of external advisors. My parents believed it was a formality. Vivian believed it was confirmation. No one expected disruption, least of all from me. I took my seat at the far side of the table unnoticed at first. The room hummed with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from rehearsed success. Charts were projected, timelines outlined, assurances offered. I listened, hands folded, heart steady. They spoke about safeguards as if they were inherent, about approvals as if they were guaranteed, about stability as if it were a trait of the company rather than a condition maintained by constant, invisible intervention. I recognized every inflection point they referenced. I had approved them. I had protected them. I had chosen not to intervene this time. The first interruption came from outside the family. A consultant asked a direct question about ownership concentration and approval authority. Nothing aggressive, just precise. Vivian answered smoothly, outlining the public structure. My father nodded along, satisfied. My mother smiled. The consultant hesitated. And the majority position he asked. The one held through the private investment entity has that stakeholder confirmed continued support under the revised terms. The room went quiet. Vivian's smile faltered just slightly. That entity has always been supportive, she said carefully. They've never interfered with operations. That's not the question, the consultant replied, still calm. Has confirmation been given for this phase? Eyes shifted. Someone glanced at the documents. Another executive cleared his throat. I felt the moment settle. They haven't responded yet. Someone said finally. But they always do. Always. I looked down at the table, then back up, meeting the consultant's gaze. They haven't responded, I said, my voice steady. Because no one asked. The room turned toward me. Not abruptly. Slowly. As if recalibrating. My father frowned. Ellie. I'm the one who needs to be asked, I continued calmly. Because I'm the one holding the position you're referring to. Silence followed. Dense. Disbelieving. My mother laughed softly, uncertain. That's not funny, she said, glancing around the room. It's not a joke, I replied. Vivian stared at me, confusion giving way to something sharper. What are you saying? She asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't elaborate unnecessarily. I'm saying the anonymous investment entity you've all been referring to for years, I said, is mine. The consultant leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing with recognition. Someone else pulled up a file, fingers moving quickly. The room filled with the sound of quiet verification. My parents said nothing. Vivian looked between me and the screen, her expression shifting as pieces aligned. That's not possible, she said, though there was no conviction left in the words. It is, I said. And it has been for a long time. The consultant cleared his throat. Ellie, he said carefully. Can you confirm the scope of your holdings? Yes, I replied. 47% held across multiple vehicles. Current valuation places it at approximately $35 billion. No one spoke. My father sat back slowly as if the chair had moved beneath him. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Vivian didn't move at all. She simply stared, her certainty collapsing inward, not dramatically but completely. I didn't want to announce it like this, I said. But it needed to be said before assumptions carried us any further. The consultant nodded once. Thank you for the clarification, he said. That answers several outstanding questions. The meeting ended shortly after. Not in chaos. In quiet urgency. People gathered their things with new care, new restraint. Conversations shifted to whispers. Plans were postponed. My parents remained seated. Vivian stayed too. No one spoke until the room was nearly empty. You've been... My mother began, then stopped. You've been supporting all of this. Yes, I said. For how long? My father asked, his voice hollow. Long enough. Vivian finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice wasn't angry. It was disoriented. Why let me believe I let you believe what everyone else believed, I said gently. That success was visible. That support was automatic. That things worked because they always had. She swallowed. So everything you achieved was yours, I said. You worked hard. You earned your position. But you didn't see the net because you never had to. My parents looked at me differently now. Not with pride, not with accusation, with uncertainty. The hierarchy they had relied on had vanished. You could have stopped this, my father said quietly. You could have told us. I could have, I agreed. But telling you earlier wouldn't have changed how you treated me. It would have changed how you needed me. No one argued with that. I stood gathering my things. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said. I'm here to be accurate. Vivian's eyes filled not with tears, but with understanding. What happens now? She asked. That depends, I said, on whether you want to build without assumptions. I left them there not because I was finished, but because the truth had already done its work. Outside, the air felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because it was no longer invisible. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. The truth had finally been spoken. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. And from that moment on, nothing would move forward without acknowledging where the real power had been all along. Silence after truth is never empty. It hums with recalibration, with people reassigning meaning to moments they thought they understood. When I walked out of that room, I felt it following me, not as noise, but as weight, redistributing itself. The city outside looked unchanged. Traffic moved. Lights blinked on in office towers. Life continued with the same indifference it always had. But something fundamental had shifted, and I knew it would take time for everyone else to feel it the way I already did. The calls didn't come right away. That surprised me. I had expected urgency, confusion, maybe even anger. Instead, there was quiet. A careful kind of quiet, like the pause people take when they realize the rules they've been playing by no longer apply. I welcomed it. In the days that followed, I watched the ripple effects unfold from a distance. Meetings were rescheduled, decisions slowed, language changed. Where certainty once lived, there was now caution. People stopped assuming outcomes and started asking questions. No one asked me to explain myself. Not formally. Not yet. And that was telling. When my parents finally reached out, it wasn't with accusations or demands. It was with uncertainty. My mother's voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. We didn't know, she said. Not as a defense. As a realization. I know, I replied. There was a long pause after that. Words hovered unspoken. Apologies, perhaps, or explanations. I didn't push for either. My father spoke next. We thought we understood how things worked. You understood what you could see, I said. That ended the conversation. Not abruptly, just honestly. Vivian didn't call that day. Or the next. I imagined her replaying conversations, moments, assumptions. I knew that kind of reckoning well. It's disorienting to realize the ground beneath you was steadier than you believed and that you never asked why. When she did call, her voice was careful, measured. I keep thinking I missed something obvious, she said. You missed what you weren't asked to look for, I replied. She exhaled slowly. I don't know how to feel. You don't have to, I said. Not yet. That seemed to help. At work, my name began to surface differently, no longer an abstract entity or an anonymous force, but a person with boundaries. People asked before assuming. They waited for confirmation instead of moving ahead with confidence alone. It wasn't reverence, it was adjustment. Power, I realized, doesn't demand attention. It alters behavior. My parents tried tentatively to return to familiar patterns. Invitations arrived framed as olive branches. Dinners proposed with careful neutrality. They spoke of family, of unity, of moving forward. I listened. I didn't reject them. I didn't accept them either. I need space, I told them. Not distance. Space. They didn't argue. That was new. Vivian and I met a week later, just the two of us. No parents, no expectations. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, the kind of place where conversations didn't echo. I thought I earned everything on my own, she said finally. You did earn it, I replied. But earning something doesn't mean it exists in isolation. She nodded, absorbing that. I don't know who I am without the safety net. You'll find out, I said. And that won't diminish you. She looked relieved. And afraid. Both made sense. What struck me most in those days wasn't the shock or the fallout, it was the way people listened differently. My words didn't carry more volume, they carried more gravity. Not because I had revealed the truth, but because the truth had removed ambiguity. I stopped receiving assumptions disguised as requests. I stopped being volunteered without consent. People waited, asked, adjusted. Silence reclaimed became something else entirely. There were moments when guilt surfaced uninvited. When I wondered if withholding the truth for so long had caused more harm than honesty would have. But each time that thought appeared, it was followed by clarity. If I had spoken earlier, they would have needed me. Now they had to see me. The difference mattered. My parents began confronting their own reflections, the favoritism they had never named, the assumptions they had never questioned. It was uncomfortable to witness, necessary, but uncomfortable. Vivian started facing her work without the invisible buffers she had grown accustomed to. She struggled, she adapted, she didn't crumble. And I learned something unexpected about myself. I wasn't relieved because the truth was out. I was relieved because I no longer had to carry it alone. The silence that once hid me now protected me not by erasing me but by defining where I ended and others began. The reckoning wasn't explosive. It was incremental. Conversations grew slower, decisions heavier, relationships more honest or more distant. Both outcomes felt acceptable. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for recognition or bracing for dismissal. I was simply present, unburdened by performance. Silence no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. And in that quiet, I understood that the hardest part was over, not because the damage was repaired, but because the truth had found its place. What remained now was choice. Letting go doesn't feel like power at first. It feels like absence, like stepping out of a room you've spent years holding together and wondering whether the walls will notice. The instinct to return, to fix, to soften, to intervene lingers long after you decide not to. I felt it every morning when I woke up and resisted the urge to check messages that weren't meant for me anymore. I had revealed the truth, but I had not reclaimed myself yet. Withdrawal. I learned is not an announcement. It's a series of small refusals that feel heavier than action ever did. I didn't dismantle anything. I didn't reverse decisions or pull funding. I simply stopped being the invisible hand that adjusted outcomes before consequences could surface. The first change was subtle. Approvals took longer. Questions circulated without immediate answers. Meetings ended with follow-ups instead of resolutions. No alarms went off. No one panicked. The system didn't break. It slowed like a body learning what it feels like without a brace. I noticed it most in the language people used. Confidence softened into caution. Statements became questions. "We've always done it this way," quietly turned into, "Can we confirm I confirmed nothing?" At first, Vivian assumed the delay was temporary. She pushed forward with the same momentum, expecting friction to dissolve the way it always had. When it didn't, she recalibrated. She worked harder, asked more questions, sat longer in meetings that used to end early. I watched her do it without stepping in. That restraint felt like standing still while someone you love stumbles, not because you want them to fall, but because catching them again would teach them nothing. I reminded myself of that every time the instinct surged. My parents noticed the strain before Vivian did. They called more often, their tone shifting from casual to concerned. "Things seem different," my mother said one evening, as if describing the weather. "Is everything okay at the company?" "Yes," I replied. "Everything is functioning as designed." She didn't like that answer. "Well," my father added carefully, "if there's anything you could do to smooth things out just temporarily, it might help everyone breathe." Everyone. The word hovered familiar and heavy. "I'm not stepping in," I said. "Not harshly, just clearly." There was a pause. "You don't mean that," my mother said, almost pleading. "I do." They tried again a few days later, this time softer. They framed it as concern for Vivian, as worry about optics, as a desire to protect what she'd built. They spoke as if my refusal were confusion, not choice. I let the silence answer them. The next shift came from the company itself. A review flagged issues that had previously been resolved quietly. A partnership hesitated. A timeline stretched. Nothing catastrophic, just real. The kind of real that had been postponed for years. Vivian felt it then. She called me late one night, her voice tired, stripped of its usual confidence. "I don't understand why everything feels heavier all of a sudden," she said. "It's like the margin is gone." "It is," I replied. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said. "You're just carrying the full weight now." She was quiet after that. Not defensive, thoughtful. "I didn't realize how much was being absorbed for me," she said finally. I didn't respond right away. I wanted the truth to settle without comfort. "I know," I said. That conversation marked a turning point. Vivian stopped expecting rescue. She stopped assuming the net would appear. She began questioning structures she had never examined before. Her competence didn't disappear, it sharpened, edged with humility. My parents, meanwhile, struggled more visibly. Without the outcomes, they'd grown used to their narratives unraveled. They searched for explanations that didn't include me. External factors, timing, market conditions. Eventually, they reached the only explanation left. They came to my apartment one afternoon unannounced. My mother's eyes were red. My father looked older than I remembered. "You're doing this on purpose," my mother said, not accusingly. "Just naming it." "I'm doing nothing," I replied. "That's the problem," my father said quietly. I didn't argue. I spent years doing something I said. No one noticed because nothing ever broke. They sat with that in silence. "You could fix this," my mother said. "You still can." "I could." I agreed, but I won't. "Why?" she asked. "Because stepping back isn't punishment," I said. "It's honesty." They didn't leave angry. They left unsettled. That felt right. As the weeks passed, the system adjusted. Not smoothly, not easily, but honestly. Decisions were made with fuller information. Risks were acknowledged instead of absorbed. Responsibility redistributed itself, sometimes clumsily. And I learned something about myself in the process. Doing nothing was harder than doing everything. Not because I felt guilty, but because restraint demanded clarity. It forced me to sit with discomfort instead of solving it for others. It required trust, not that things would go perfectly, but that they would go truthfully. Vivian began standing on her own without resenting the ground beneath her. My parents began confronting the limits of their assumptions. The company moved forward more slowly but with fewer illusions. And I finally understood the cost of being indispensable. When you're always there to prevent the fall, no one learns how to balance. Withdrawal didn't make me smaller. It made me precise. It showed me where my responsibility ended and where others began. It returned my time, my focus, my life. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. For the first time, I wasn't holding everything together. I was letting it stand on its own. And whatever came next would be built without my silence doing the work for everyone else. Reality doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through missed expectations, unanswered questions, and moments where confidence finally runs out of excuses. By the time the consequences became undeniable, no one could pretend they were surprised. They could only admit they hadn't wanted to look. The first real failure came quietly. A partnership Vivian had counted on stalled during final review. Not rejected, not approved, just paused. The kind of pause that forces scrutiny, the kind that doesn't bend to optimism. I heard about it indirectly through a forwarded message that wasn't meant for me. The language was careful, neutral, stripped of reassurance. Concerns had been raised, clarifications required, timelines extended. For the first time, there was no invisible correction waiting to catch it. Vivian felt the shift immediately. Meetings stretched longer. Questions sharpened. The safety net she had never seen was suddenly absent, and the ground beneath her felt unfamiliar. She didn't collapse under it. She adjusted. But adjustment is work, and work exposes what protection once concealed. My parents felt it differently. To them, the stall wasn't a process issue. It was a loss of certainty. They had built their pride on momentum, on the belief that success moved in one direction if you were good enough. Now that belief was cracking. They called me the morning the delay became official. "We need to talk," my father said. No preamble, no warmth. We met later that day at their house, the same living room where assumptions had once felt permanent. My mother sat rigidly, hands clasped. My father paced, stopping only when he had something to say. "This didn't have to happen," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "It didn't." My mother looked up sharply. "Then why did it?" "Because nothing was holding it together anymore," I said. "That's not fair," she replied, her voice trembling. "You knew what would happen." "Yes," I said. "And so did you." Silence settled between us. Heavy. Unavoidable. "You could step back in," my father said, quieter now. "Just to stabilize things. Just until this passes. Just—" The word returned like an old reflex. "I won't," I said. "Why are you doing this?" my mother asked. "To teach us a lesson?" I shook my head. "No, I'm doing it because I already learned mine." They didn't understand at first. They thought this was anger, resentment, punishment. They searched my face for signs of cruelty and found none. That unsettled them more than anger ever could have. "This is what happens when assumptions replace awareness," I said. "You assumed things worked because they always had. You assumed my role was permanent because it was convenient. You never asked what it cost." My father sat down slowly, the fight leaving his posture. "We thought you were—" "Fine." "I was functional," I said. "That's not the same thing." Vivian reached out later that night. Her voice was strained, stripped of performance. "They're asking questions I don't have answers to," she said. "They're looking at everything." "They should," I replied. "I don't know if I deserve to be here," she admitted. That stopped me. "You deserve your position," I said carefully. "But deserving something doesn't mean it was never supported." She exhaled. "I don't know how to separate the two." "You don't have to right now," I said. "You just have to stop pretending they're the same." She was quiet after that. Not defensive. Reflective. Over the next weeks, the consequences continued, not as a collapse, but as exposure. Reviews uncovered risks that had been mitigated quietly for years. Processes slowed. Decisions carried weight instead of assumption. The company didn't fall apart. It grew up. My parents struggled the most. Without outcomes to hide behind, they were left with their choices. The favoritism they had never named, the expectations they had never questioned. They tried to apologize, once awkwardly tripping over language that felt foreign to them. "We didn't mean to," my mother began. "I know," I said. "That's why it happened." Intent didn't erase impact. We all understood that now. Vivian adapted faster than anyone expected. Without the buffer, she learned to navigate resistance, to ask harder questions, to sit with uncertainty instead of assuming it would disappear. Her confidence changed shape. It lost its gloss and gained weight. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt. I had imagined relief would come with recognition, with acknowledgement. Instead, what I felt was finality. A door closing quietly behind me. I accepted that some relationships don't return to what they were, not because they're broken, but because the truth has changed their shape. Distance isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's alignment. One evening, my father said something that stayed with me. "We built our certainty on you," he said, "and never asked if you wanted to be the foundation." I nodded. That's the cost of assumptions. He didn't argue. By then, I knew I wouldn't step back in. Not fully. Not invisibly. Whatever support I chose to offer in the future would be deliberate bounded seen. Or it wouldn't exist at all. The reckoning wasn't loud. It didn't end with apologies or forgiveness or dramatic reconciliation. It ended with understanding slow, uncomfortable, irreversible. I didn't feel powerful. I felt free. Free from the need to be indispensable. Free from the weight of carrying what no one acknowledged. Free to choose what I gave and what I kept. The cost had been high. For all of us. But for the first time, the price was honest. And that I realized was the only kind of resolution that lasts. The quiet that followed felt different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't heavy with avoidance or strained by things left unsaid. It was steady, settled. The kind of quiet that arrives when decisions have already been made and no longer need defending. Weeks had passed since the reckoning, and life had resumed its ordinary rhythms. I woke up without bracing myself for messages I didn't want to answer. I planned my days without leaving space for emergencies that weren't mine. For the first time in years, my time felt like it belonged to me. The company continued forward slower and more deliberate than before. It no longer moved on momentum alone. Vivian was still there, still capable, still learning what it meant to stand without invisible support. She didn't call as often. When she did, it wasn't to unload or lean. It was to ask real questions, to think out loud, to navigate uncertainty without expecting someone else to absorb it for her. I was proud of her in a way that felt cleaner than pride ever had before. My parents were quieter too. Not distant exactly, but cautious. Conversations stayed on the surface more often than not. They no longer spoke as if my life were an extension of theirs, no longer assumed my agreement before hearing my answer. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. There were no dramatic apologies, no sweeping reconciliation, just an understanding finally acknowledged that things would not return to the way they had been. And I didn't want them to. I spent more time alone than I used to, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt intentional. I took walks without thinking about who might need me later. I read books without checking my phone between pages. I noticed how much of my energy had been spent anticipating demands that never should have existed in the first place. Silence reclaimed had become something else entirely. I thought often about the years I had stayed quiet, about whether I would do it differently if given the chance. The answer surprised me. I wouldn't erase that silence. It taught me too much. It showed me who people were when they thought I had nothing to offer. It revealed how easily love turns conditional when power goes unseen. But I also knew I would never mistake silence for obligation again. There is a difference between choosing quiet and being assigned it, between restraint and erasure, between support freely given and sacrifice quietly expected. I had crossed that line without realizing it, and it had cost me more than I knew at the time. The cost in the end wasn't the money or the effort, or even the relationships that changed shape. It was the years I spent believing that staying small made things easier for everyone else. It didn't. It just made the truth harder to face when it finally arrived. Vivian found her footing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without the safety net, she discovered limits she could push against honestly. Her confidence softened into something sturdier, less performative, more real. She didn't thank me for stepping back, and she didn't need to. Growth doesn't require gratitude. It requires space. My parents learned more slowly. Some lessons take longer to settle. But they learned enough to stop assuming, enough to pause, enough to understand that certainty built on someone else's silence is never as solid as it looks. As for me, I learned that power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Real power is the freedom to say no without explanation, to step back without guilt, to choose what you give and what you keep. I no longer felt the urge to prove anything, not to them, not to anyone. The silence I carried now wasn't protective or strategic. It was peaceful. If any part of this story feels familiar, if you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the reliable one, the one who carried more than anyone realized, I see you. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't announce your strength, or taken for granted because your support was consistent, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your story. Not because it needs fixing, but because it deserves to be acknowledged. If you feel comfortable, share what silence taught you or where you're still holding back when you don't have to anymore. Stories like this don't end with one revelation. They unfold wherever people decide to reclaim their voice quietly and honestly. If you want to keep exploring these kinds of stories where hidden strength becomes clarity and boundaries become freedom, you're welcome to stay. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't speaking louder. It's choosing finally to be heard.